a pretty mellow gay. That's auto-correcting my script. I'm normally a pretty mellow guy, but this chip performance is something that I'm super pumped about, and you should be too. So in this video, we're going to compare the improvements on the Silicon M1 chip from that new 8GB MacBook Pro. We're going to also compare it to a 64GB i7 Mac Mini, and in addition, a 16GB i7 MacBook Pro. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. We're all about creativity in filmmaking. So if that's something that you're into, consider subscribing. All right, let's start with a render and export test of one of my YouTube videos before we get into some standard tests. And at the end of the video, we'll talk through some of the concerns you should be concerned about before upgrading. Now, all of these tests were done on the SanDisk Extreme SSD, and I highly recommend, if you're even considering upgrading or if you do any video editing to begin with, you pick up an SSD. This is my favorite. So my latest YouTube video is the Ronin SC portrait mode video, which happens to be kind of David Dobrik style at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Now this was recorded in 4K 24 frames per second, 420 at 10-bit. I then edited it on a 4K ProRes 24 frames per second timeline in Final Cut Pro. Now for this test, I had to turn off any third-party plugins because Silicon does not support some of them. So the test that we're going to run or have run is the same across all three computers. And of course, because as you know as a Mac user, if you're video editing, you turn off all other programs. So for the Mac Mini render, we got 10 minutes and 5 seconds. For export, 4 minutes 52. For the MacBook Pro render, we got 10 minutes 54, so very similar. MacBook Pro export was 5 minutes 41 seconds. The Silicon render times 2 minutes and 21 seconds. Export 2 minutes 48. Those numbers show render speeds as 4 times as fast and export speeds at twice as fast. Cool, so that's one of my standard YouTube videos. Now let's discuss some standard tests. So I filmed 3 clips, each 20 seconds in length. So we have 24 frames per second at 422 10-bit, 60 frames per second, same parameters, and 120 frames per second. So let's take a look at the dropped frame rates and see how Silicon does in comparison. This is madness, by the way. All right, so as you can see, Mac Mini is doing terribly across all 3 types of footage, just dropping left, right, and center. MacBook Pro, just as bad, if not a little bit worse. But Silicon seems to be doing fine. The next thing was adding stabilization to footage. Now, typically, this is pretty intense on Mac Mini and MacBook Pro. Super interesting to see what it's like on Silicon. So for a 20-second clip, the Mac Mini took 1 minute 28 seconds. MacBook Pro took 49 seconds. And for the Silicon, 6.49 seconds. Now, I actually caught myself smirking when I was doing this. That means Silicon's over 12 times faster than the 64GB Mac Mini and over 7 times faster than the 16GB MacBook Pro. All right, then, so next, applying LUTs. And some of you may be thinking, oh no, you've got to color correct, then you've got to color grade, you can't just add LUTs, what a disgraceful thing to do. But the truth is, a lot of people do just apply LUTs, and that's fine, right? So the Mac Mini, for the same 20-second clip, I used one of my LUTs, so Mac Mini took 35 seconds, MacBook Pro took 50 seconds, and then the Silicon took 3.78 seconds. Now, of course, there was a little smirk in there as I was going through this. So that means Silicon was 9 times faster than the Mac Mini and over 12 times faster than the MacBook Pro. Like, just unbelievable. For an 8GB of RAM. What? But I gotta calm down for a second because then we came to exporting and I didn't see as big a differences here as you may be expecting, or at least I did in the rendering. So for those 20-second clips, I exported video and audio at H.264. So for the Mac Mini, got 47.77 seconds. MacBook Pro, a little bit higher, 1 minute and 5 seconds. And Silicon at 42.36. So that actually was pretty similar to the Mac Mini. Then I decided to move away from all of my own custom footage and we'll do a pretty standard test that you can also do, which is the Bruce X Final Cut Pro test. Basically, it's just a clip with clips, generators, transitions, titles, etc. So for the Mac Mini, we got render speeds of 44.54 and export speeds of 57.08. MacBook Pro render of 1 minute and 11 seconds, export of 1 minute 22. Silicon was rendering at 22.58 and exporting at 28.35. So Silicon on this standardized test was at least twice as fast as Mac Mini and the MacBook Pro. Now what this does tell us is that Silicon has been optimized for those higher resolution, higher quality bitrate footages, clips, video files. All right, so then we move on to temperatures of these, and Macs are notoriously bad for heat distribution. So Mac Mini, because it's off to one side, I don't typically notice the heat, but as I'm rendering, obviously the fans do kick on. I get a nice blast of air from the side since it's right there, but it does get a little bit warm, especially toward the end of rendering or end of exporting. For the MacBook Pro, I mean, you all know that this is terrible. It's gonna get super hot. Sometimes it's honestly, when I say sometimes, when I'm rendering for extended periods of time or exporting for extended periods of time, it often burns my legs if I have it on my lap. You can't touch it with your hands. Honestly, pretty unbelievable for a piece of kit that's meant to be so expensive. And then you have Silicon. I don't think Silicon even realized that it was doing anything. I think it was just hanging out, while rendering and while exporting, just chilling. So with temperature comes noise. Now we've already said that the Mac Mini, you do get that fan noise, and I feel the air blowing directly on my face right here. MacBook Pro, sometimes the noise gets so intense that I have to ramp up the volume on what I'm listening to on my actual Mac to overcome that noise, and forget trying to do any recording while MacBook Pro is rendering. It's not gonna happen. But for Silicon, it's like that cool dude that sat in the corner just chilling. He's got a leather jacket on, he's got a toothpick in his mouth. And if you don't get the reference, it was nothing for Silicon, just straight chilling again. So that concludes my test, and for my recommendation, highly worth the upgrade. Typically, if there was minimal improvements, I wouldn't recommend upgrading since it's so much of a cost, but the price of these is so enticing, the improvement is mad, I would highly recommend upgrading. This was all on the 8 gig, remember, so even on the 16 gig, which hasn't come in yet, I'm sure there'll be vast improvements on that too. And I'll leave links below to those. So in a future video, I'll also be covering the battery life. I have to say, MacBook Pro battery life while rendering, awful. It'd be very interesting to see over an extended period of time what it's like for Silicon. I'll also talk through support for Premiere and what Premiere looks like on Silicon. Are there major improvements? And then of course, if you like to use third-party plugins, at the moment I'm talking Pixel Film Studios type stuff, don't upgrade because they are not supported on Big Sur or on the Silicon chips. So you might want to wait a little bit for that. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know below and we'll try and include them on the second video. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, do what you gotta do, and I'll see you guys in the next one.